Alright, hello everybody, it's AW here with Josh and Chaya. We'll see if Hyperion drops in by sometime within while we're reading. Today we have something that is special on the level of the Posadis reading, except not a meme. Because today we're reading something by Ilyenkov. Ilyenkov, which is, by the way, probably the most respectable of all the Soviet philosophers. Probably, as far as I understand it, like the only really recognized, like legit Soviet philosopher in the dialectical style, as opposed to the.
I mean, there were a bunch of philosophers who were legit during the early days of the Soviet Union, like Vygotsky.
Well, I don't know if you would term Vygotsky specifically a philosopher. I mean, Vygotsky did have some certain things which were interestingly dialectical, but his stuff is mostly subsumed by into what's called into what's now is called activity theory. I think like one of the people who focuses on that a lot is what's his name? His name's just not popping up in my head right now. Australian dude, Andy Blunden. That's who. You can check up Andy Blunden's like personal site and see a whole bunch of essays about that. His main influences are indeed Ilyenkov's reading of Hegel, reading of the Logic, reading of Capital, and I think I don't think he considers himself specifically a Leninist anymore. He used to be. But anyways, this is Ilyenkov's Cosmology of the Spirit, with a very long subtitle, an attempt to give a basic outline of the objective role of thinking matter in the system of universal interaction, a philosophical poetic phantasmagoria based on the principles of dialectical materialism. A mouthful.
Yeah. Alright, link me. Really?
Of course.
I was telling them not to read it without you, but thankfully you're here on time.
We're actually recording. We're reading Ilyenkov's Cosmology of the Spirit.
Nice.
So right, there we go. All the standard members are here. The tetrad, or what is it called now?
A gang of four.
Yeah. I suppose. Doesn't sound. There was like a Roman term that was for the.
You mean quad?
Nah, it has something like with a tetrad, but it sounded cooler.
Oh.
But anyways, you will see why this is Posadist. This is Posadist here, but a lot more serious, yet still pretty esoteric, and probably as close to mysticism as Ilyenkov ever got.
I was about to say Ilyenkov confirmed for closeted mystic.
Oh, and again, we'll link this in the description. This was actually translated just very recently. This wasn't in English until this year. A bunch of these works by Ilyenkov were only in Russian until recently, in which this work and a bunch of other works about the Russian cosmists are being translated. But the abstract Evald Ilyenkov's Cosmology of the Spirit was written in the 1950s and published posthumously only in the end of the 1980s, as it was too heretical to be published in the author's lifetime. The text was heretical not because it was dissident or critical of the Soviet Union where the philosopher lived all his life, but because of its enormously speculative and hypothetical nature. Addressing the physicist idea of the thermal death of the universe and creating an original combination of the Hegelian dialectics and Spinoza's notion of the attribute, Ilyenkov claims that thought and seemingly contingent emergence of thinking life is a necessary attribute of matter, as it is able to prevent the terminal entropic collapse. While other works by Ilyenkov were translated into several European languages, Cosmology of the Spirit will be available in English translation for the first time, right here, right now. And you're probably listening to the first English recording of this fine, fine work. Hopefully the TV and people talking in the background is not too overbearing.
I don't even hear it.
Today.
Oh, good. But all right, do us the honors, Hyperion. Read.
All right. Committing no crime against the axioms of dialectical materialism, one can state that matter constantly possesses thought, constantly thinks itself. This, of course, does not mean that matter in each of its particles at each moment possesses the capacity to think and thinks in its actuality. This is valid in relation to matter as a whole, as a substance, infinite in time and space. Matter, with the necessity inherent in its nature, constantly engenders thinking creatures, constantly reproduces, now here, now there, an organ of thinking, the thinking brain. And by virtue of the infinity of space, this organ thus exists in its actuality in each finite moment of time, somewhere in the fold of infinite space. Or, contrariwise, in each finite point of space, here by virtue of the infinity of time, thought is also realized sooner or later, if these words are applicable to infinite time, and each particle of matter by virtue of this, at some point in the fold of infinite time, forms an integral part of a thinking brain. That is, it thinks. Therefore, it is possible to say, in each actual given moment of time, thought is an intrinsic property of matter. If at one point of infinite space, matter destroys an organ of thought, the thinking brain, so with the same iron necessity of, at the same time, in some other point, it reproduces this organ. The organ through which matter thinks of itself, consequently, does not disappear at any single moment of infinite time, and thus matter constantly possesses thought as one of its attributes. It cannot forfeit it for a single moment. Moreover, one must assume that a brain that thinks, in its actuality, always exists in the fold of infinity, simultaneously at all the stages of its development, at some points in the stage of its genesis, at others during the phase of its decline, and at others again during the peak of its development and potency.
Meaning hyper-advanced, interdimensional, communist space aliens.
Yeah. Quote, matter in its eternal cycle moves according to laws, which at a definite stage, now here, now there, necessarily give rise to the thinking mind in organic beings, end quote. Engels, 1974. In this sense, dialectical materialism restores the simple and profound statement of Bruno and Spinoza in a rational form, that in matter, taken as a whole, development lies in their actual consummation at every finite point of time, or moment of time. In matter, all the stages and forms of the necessary development are, simultaneously, found in their actual realization. Taken as a whole, matter does not develop. Not for a single moment can it lose a single attribute, nor can it acquire a single new attribute.
So, talking on the cosmic scale, everything that's possible is already done. Somewhere, somehow. Somebody's already got communism. Somebody's already blown themselves up because they're stupid Borgs. And then the rest of us are somewhere in between.
Yeah.
But everything's going on at once, somewhere, somehow.
Oh, you mean bourgeois Borgs? I thought you were talking about the Borg
Yeah,
in Star Trek.
burgers.
Yeah, Bergs. Yeah, burgers. This naturally not only does not contradict, but on the contrary presupposes the thesis that in each single finite sphere of its existence, however large it may be, there is always an operating dialectical development. But that which is valid for each single finite part of matter is not valid in relation to matter as a whole, to matter understood as substance. As substance, matter cannot be represented as a single sum of its finite parts, and all the theoretical principles valid for each of its finite parts then become invalid in relation to matter as a whole, in its eternal, closed in itself, big circle. In relation to each... Huh?
I was just going to note that, yeah, like the whole substance,
Yeah,
that whole
okay.
substance thing is Spinoza straight up.
In relation to each separate finite sphere of its existence, it is true that thought arises on the basis of, and following, other simpler forms of existence of matter, and does not always exist, whereas other forms of matter exist always, constituting a necessary precondition and the conditions for the generation of thought. But in relation to matter as a whole, to matter understood as universal substance, this thesis is not valid. Here, another thesis is valid. Not only can thought not exist without matter, this is acknowledged by every materialist, including by metaphysical materialists such as Holbach, but it also holds that matter cannot exist without thought, and this thesis can be shared only by a dialectic and materialist, the kind of materialist Spinoza is. Just as there is not thought without matter, understood as substance, so there is not matter without thought, understood as its attribute. To conceive of matter as a whole, as universal substance deprived of thought as one of its attributes, means conceiving it inadequately, more meager than it is in actual fact. This would mean, in the theoretical definition of matter as substance, insofar as it is not only a pure gnosiological category, it would arbitrarily omit one of its universal and necessary attributional definitions. This would mean giving an invalid definition of matter as substance and reducing it to a purely gnosiological category. Lenin, it will be recalled, believed it to be absolutely necessary to, quote, deepen the knowledge of matter to the concept of substance, end quote, for only in this case will it forfeit its purely gnosiological sense. And gnosiological here means just, like, learning it for the sake of learning it, not for application or whatever. And although the thesis, quote, just as there is no thought without matter, so is there is no thought without thought, matter without thought, end quote, may sound unexpected, it is precisely in this thesis that the single principal distinction separating dialectical materialism, that is the materialism of Spinoza, Engels, and Lenin, from mechanistic materialism, the materialism of Galilei, Newton, and Hobbes and Holbach, can be found. This thesis is beyond the reach of the latter. Mechanistic materialism understands thought only as a product of matter, as one of the properties of matter, and for this very reason as a property that is more or less accidental. Quote, that matter evolves out of itself, the thinking human brain is for mechanism a pure accident, although necessarily determined, step by step, where it happens, end quote, Engels, 1974. According to this perspective, thought may not even take place, for this is only a more or less accidental exception, the product of a fortuitous combination of circumstances, without any detriment to matter in general. Quote, but the truth is that it is the nature of matter to advance to the evolution of thinking beings, end quote. Engels objects to this position. Quote, hence This always necessarily occurs wherever those conditions for it are present, end quote. Engels, 1974 again. And these necessary conditions are essentially, once again, not ones of pure contingency. They themselves create, with the same iron necessity, that same universal motion, and consequently matter as a whole necessarily possesses thought permanently in its actuality and cannot forfeit it for a single moment of its existence in infinite time and infinite space. All right, anything to say so far?
Yeah, pretty straightforward.
Yep. All right. Consequently, if philosophy as science considers only universal, infinite forms of existence and the development of matter, and if its scientific principles concern only those forms, then dialectical and materialist philosophy should not contain the thesis, quote, "There is no thought without matter, but there is matter without thought," end quote. Rather, it should contain another thesis, embracing an understanding of the infinite dialectics of their relation, quote, "Just as there is no thought without matter, so there is no matter without thought," end quote. This thesis corresponds far more to a common philosophical perspective to the question, as well as to the dialectical, and not merely materialist, solution to this question. Thought is undoubtedly... skipped it. Yeah. The following point of the dialectical and materialist understanding of the problem has hitherto been little elucidated upon, but it is one upon which much is incumbent and regards an understanding of thought, of thinking matter, as the supreme, absolute highest form of motion and development. Thought is undoubtedly the highest product of universal development, is the highest stage of organizing interactions, the limit of the complexity of this organization. Not only does science not know such a form more highly organized than the thinking brain, but neither can philosophy admit in principle of such a form as possible, for by doing so, it would render philosophy itself impossible. In this case, the notion of a fundamental cognizability of the surrounding world breaks down, rendering any other philosophical system, apart from skepticism or a positivist form of agnosticism, impossible. If matter is in any way capable of engendering some higher form of motion than the thinking brain, a form that would be located in the same fundamental relation to the thinking brain, by which, for example, biological motion is related to chemical, then such an assumption would be completely equivalent to the acknowledgement of a sphere of activity that is fundamentally unknowable by thought. That's pretty dense, but I get it, but
Basically, I mean, it's a basic transcendental point. If something was beyond us, it would literally be unthinkable.
Which we don't think is... well, okay. Could be possible, but probably not. In fact, this hypothetical form of development, one even more highly organized than the thinking brain, can't be related to the sphere of material phenomena. It would presuppose, as its historically necessary and its historically surpassed condition, overcome by development, not only a nature existing beyond, external to, and independent of thought, but also thought itself. This would be a certain form of development that would be possible only subsequent to thought and founded upon it. In other words, thought would have been preserved in it in terms of the sublated, overcome, incidental, and non-existent moment, after the manner of how chemical and mechanical movement in a living organism is transformed into an incidental form of its existence. The laws of such a hypothetically postulated form of development could not be reduced to the laws of thought, nor deduced, that is, understood, proceeding from these laws. In other words, this form of development would be fundamentally unknowable by thought, but, in terms of its higher organization, would have dominated thought as some kind of elusive sphere of actuality whose laws are fundamentally inconceivable.
So that's just straight up
way,
typical Hegelian transcendental dialect. Sorry about that.
Oh, no, it's cool.
Transcendental dialectics, it's the way that the higher concepts subsume lower concepts, but the lower concepts, from their own perspective, if you were really stuck on that level and that was your limit, you could not go any higher. You couldn't see the very thing you were within. So, for example, I mean, like, he's talking about something higher than thought. To us, it's inconceivable. It doesn't seem to me like there is such a thing. It doesn't seem a coherent thing. Because thought is already pretty much self-transcendental, so what could be more transcendental than whatever's already self-transcendental? Doesn't make sense. But say, for example, 4D, 5D, 6D, whatever. Those things could be one of those things in which it could be the case, but we don't have any way to really conceive of it as an existent thing other than, mathematical abstractions and whatnot. But even then, that's not really true, because we do know how to conceive what something like that would kind of look like if it interacted in our world in various ways, and so it's not truly transcendental at all. And to bring Posadas into this, I mean, the whole idea of aliens, a lot of people go like, oh, the aliens are just so far beyond us and blah, blah. Well, I mean, I don't know. Quite a lot of them, it's people act as if it's like the version of, a lot of religious people say, well, God acts in mysterious ways, and a lot of the people in the UFO community have the exact same idea. Aliens act in mysterious ways. But I don't think so. I think a lot of them are just either as confused as we are, or, another kind of dick.
Okay. In this way, we would have returned to the advanced conception of Immanuel Kant. The world of phenomena, both those surrounding us as well as those phenomena of thought itself, would be transformed into a form of external manifestation of a certain higher essence in terms of their laws, an essence that is fundamentally, as a thing in itself, inconceivable. In other words, by this admission, we would have made fundamentally possible any type of mysticism and devilish drivel. We would have admitted that there still exists a certain something above nature and above thought, and this something, by virtue of its supernatural complexity, would be fundamentally unknowable and inconceivable to thought. And it is of no import what title we use to name this higher form of development, this more complex form of organized motion, than the thinking brain. Its essence would remain entirely the same, namely the essence of the idea of God, providence, world spirit, and so on. And this perspective, inevitably resulting from assuming the possibility of a higher organization of motion of the world process than the thinking brain, would be equally as idealistic as the absolute idealism of the Hegelian system, but it would have differed from the latter in that it would have necessarily assumed the higher reality to be inconceivable to thought. In other words, its perspective would be the closest of all to the Kantian one. In Hegel, even if a suprahuman reason is admitted, then thought is nevertheless attributed with the capacity of developing to such a level where it, not ceasing to be thought, nonetheless remains equal in its power to that world spirit. In logic, according to Hegel, the laws of thought nevertheless do coincide with the laws of the absolute, and become correspondent to them. But this means that thought, although following a cunning path, is elevated all the same to the rank of the supreme reality. In sum, in the phenomenology of spirit, human thinking becomes identical with the absolute, apprehending laws that absolute reason submits itself to, and thereby converts itself to an embodiment of this supreme reality, becoming a form of motion, higher and more complex, of which there is nothing and can no longer be anything. And this understanding marked a step forward in compared to Kant's conception, And it's clear that the admission of a more highly organized form of development of the universe than thought, however it be interpreted, materialistically or idealistically, is perfectly equivalent to the adoption of the thesis of the fundamental unknowability of the world, of the higher laws which it submits itself to in its existence. Dialectical materialism. Insofar as it is not a system of positivistically interpreted scientific data, but a philosophical system as a special science, is compelled to acknowledge, like any philosophical system with the exception of agnostic or skeptical ones, that the thinking brain is the supreme form of organization of matter, while thought, as the capacity of the brain, is equally the highest level that universal matter can reach in its gradual development.
I don't know. I question the reality of such things. It seems.
What do you mean?
Well, I mean, I don't know. Stuff like
You don't know what you mean?
stuff like astral projection, man. It seems that
Oh,
there's
yeah.
a more subtle body.
Oh yeah.
Sure, but do you think that? Well, that's still like a thought. I mean, it has to be.
Oh yeah, but it's not brains.
Yeah, it's not brains. It's outside the brain, but it's a projection from the brain, isn't it?
I wouldn't reduce it all to the brain.
Yeah, no.
Yeah,
People
you're
probably
people
right.
who have near-death experiences, like aren't having a functioning brain. That's for sure.
Yeah.
So whatever goes on there, unless one wants to like seriously go towards a really dismissive extreme and just say, look, it's all an illusion about either when you were going under or you were waking up, but nothing happened in between. But there are some stories that should make one really question that.
I mean, I've had an out-of-body experience before. I mean, I don't want to tell it, go on and on and on and tell a story about it, but I mean, it was something else. I mean, I wouldn't say it was all in my head, as is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. So the brain is both catalyst for interaction in this dimension, but also limiter insofar as, if we didn't have a brain, we could probably move freely through the air or whatever.
I
don't know.
wouldn't say that.
I don't know, what is it?
But I mean, you're still moving through matter.
Yeah.
Whatever matter is. I mean, I think the concept of matter is not exactly limited to like what we are used to being matter.
Yeah, because
I mean, it's just basically the form of
spiritual matter.
Yeah, it's just basically the form of substantive embodiment. Like there is no other characteristic matter requires at all. So you could have the idea of ethereal beings, for example, is nothing crazy. When you really think about it, it's still a form of matter. It may be a finer form of matter, a different form of matter, but it's still matter. And I mean, that just assumes a whole bunch of... it assumes a lot of things. If we're all in the Matrix, brains and stuff doesn't matter.
Therefore, thought is the supreme product of the development of the universe. In it, in the birth of the thinking brain, universal matter attains such a degree after which all possibilities of further development, quote, above, are exhausted. In terms of the complicated organization of forms of motion, after that, the path can only lead down along the path of decomposition of this organization to a purely biological physiological level, in the case of mental deterioration, or still further, to simply chemistry in the case of the physiological death of the brain. The path further upward is excluded. The thinking matter of the brain, the form of motion that emerges as thought, is the supreme and most intransgressible boundary of gradual development. This is an entirely necessary conclusion of every scientific philosophy, with the exclusion, as we've already shown, of agnosticism and skepticism, a conclusion whose compelling necessity has been recognized by all systems of scientific philosophy. The system of Spinoza or Fichte, Hegel or Engels. The differences between materialism and idealism pass along another line of thought, along the line of interpretation of thought itself and its interaction with the material world. But in the recognition of thought as the supreme form of development of the universe, all philosophical systems coincide, because this recognition is a necessary condition of the existence and development of philosophy itself. If it were not so, then philosophy would not draw a single responsible and categorical conclusion. Indeed, it couldn't be considered a science at all. Thus, the thinking brain, with its ability to think, is the absolute limit of development in terms of gradual development. But the gradual character of development is not the only form of development. Otherwise, it would have led to bad infinity, whereas the true infinity has, as it will be recalled, the form of a circle, that of a big circle. And this colossal big circle, not having a beginning nor an end, a big circle in which universal matter loses not one of its attributes that it possesses, and acquires not a single new attribute, comprises, in a ring-like form, all the possible finite cycles of development.
So
The
is
circular
it me,
character.
or
Sorry,
did
go
he
on. Yeah.
not in the previous
What?
page just admit, but in the recognition of thought as the supreme form of development of the universe, all philosophical systems coincide, because of this recognition is a necessary condition of the existence and development of philosophy itself. Isn't that basically just admitting that his materialism is an idealism?
Well, yeah, but he can't call it idealism.
Doesn't coincide with the party line.
Yeah.
I think what he's just trying to do here is try to present idealism in a way that seems materialist, so that the party doesn't get it in for it.
Perhaps. The circular character of infinity is the only one that corresponds to the dialectical view. An alternative to this conception can be only an idea, including within it the idea of the beginning and the end of universal development, the first impulse, a condition equal to itself, and the such like. Thus, thought as an attribute, and moreover in its capacity as supreme product of universal development, is included in this eternal big circle of universal matter, all the time renewing its cycles. It appears as one of the links in the circle of development, as a link through which the whole big circle passes, somehow in its entirety with a certain iron necessity. In other words, the thinking brain, as one of the necessary links, locking together the universal big circle of universal matter. In the sense of gradual development, this is the absolute peak point of the circle, subsequently followed by the return of matter to a more elementary and previously surpassed forms. Biological, chemical, the fiery liquid or incandescent and nebulous mass of celestial bodies, in the cold and undifferentiated rarefied dust of the nebulae, in the gassy fog of intergalactic space, in the purely mechanical translocation of elemental particles, etc., etc. We should immediately mention an important consequence that inevitably results from this acknowledgement of the supreme form of development. Having acknowledged the impossibility of higher forms than thought, than the thinking brain, as a theoretically necessary condition, we are also compelled to acknowledge a boundary lower than which the existence of matter turns out to be impossible. Evidently, we are far from discovering this scientifically, but it is necessary to assume this theoretically. Assuming that any organized matter higher and more complex than the thinking brain cannot exist due to the very nature of things, in the same way we also acknowledge an opposing limit, the boundary of simply organized matter, the absolutely simplest form of motion, relative to the starting point of the cycle. Otherwise, one ends up with an incongruity. On the one hand, that in terms of the complex organized matter and its forms of motion, a boundary is assumed, while on the other hand, in terms of the simplification of its organized form, one assumes a bad infinity. Engels fully allows for such a condition in which all particular properties of matter disappear, while only those properties characterizing it as simple matter remain, with the assumption that such a condition is realized, quote, in the gaseous sphere of the nebula, end quote. All substances in this condition, Engels assumes, quote, become merged in pure matter, as such, acting only as matter, not according to their specific properties, end quote. That was Engels in 1974, yet again. We should add here that contemporary physics, in its attempt to reveal the simplest laws linking space, motion, and time, arrives at the idea of the quantization of space and time, with the idea of elementary space, time, and movement, quantum, as that limit of divisibility from which, if one passes through it, the objective interconditionality of motion, time, and space would disappear. A particle that in reality, and not just in abstract terms, realizes the pure form of mechanical motion, a particle deprived of any properties apart from purely mechanical ones. Mechanical here is understood not in the sense of Newtonian physics, but in the sense of the theory of relativity in its rational form, in the dialectical materialist form.
No idea what the fuck he means.
So he's co-opting the theory of relativity that was, gaining traction, I guess. I mean, I don't know when this was written, but,
1950.
Oh, okay.
This is long after.
Yeah, it was already established.
Long after, like,
Far
Lenin's, like, autism and imperial criticism had, like, said that relativity was stupid because it was bourgeois and undialectical.
Yeah, the enlightened Ilyenkov knew that we can make the devil work for us by co-opting everything bad. Well, bad, not bad, but like bourgeois, I guess, Western theory. Such a particle should evidently be acknowledged, a particle deprived of chemical, electric, and other such properties. From a philosophical and theoretical perspective, there is nothing mechanistic in this, but this is the conclusion automatically emerging from the acknowledgement of the supreme level of organization of matter. An acknowledgement of the absolutely highest forms possible without acknowledging its opposite. Is impossible without acknowledging its opposite. The absolutely lowest, absolutely simplest form of matter and its motion. Is he going to start talking about David Hume?
Nope.
That was a joke. Along with the atom disappear the chemical properties, along with the electron disappear the electrical properties of matter, and somewhere, evidently, there exists a boundary that can't be crossed without contravening the mechanical properties. That is, the connection of simple transposition with the spatial and temporal characteristics of objective reality. The state perhaps materializes, and not in a gassy sphere of the nebula, as Engels assumed. The gassy sphere itself, most likely, is in some way a more complicated stage of interaction, but in the form of a field, as the absolutely lowest form of engagement with organized matter, as an actual existence of matter that can be reduced no further, as an absolute undifferentiation of its condition. That's the second precondition of the hypothesis. of the hypotheses. The third philosophical and theoretical prerequisite of the hypotheses is the incontrovertible point according to which all that exists is worthy of destruction, that each finite form of existence has its beginning and its end. This condition is applicable both to the present solar planetary system as it is to the humankind inhabiting it.
Here's where it begins.
We're all gonna die. Yeah, it's cosmology.
All that exists is worthy of destruction, is a quote from Engels.
Yeah. Did he mean that in the literal materialist sense, or the
He
like
meant,
forms of government,
he
or
meant
what?
it in every sense. Like he
Probably.
quotes like Hegel's, like, if all that is rational is real, and then Engels says, well, the materialistly inversion of that is that all that exists should be destroyed, like, because dialectics never stop.
Yeah. It's clear that sometime. Sorry, let me get a drink of water. It's clear that sometime in the dark future of times to come, humanity will cease to exist, and that the eternal flow of motion of the universe will, at long last, wash away and wipe out all traces of human culture. Earth itself will be scattered into the dust of cosmic space, and will be dissolved into the eternal big circle of universal matter.
Yeah, for the Engels quote, Engels wrote, in accordance with all the rules of Hegelian method. Let me just restart it. In accordance with all the rules of the Hegelian method of thought, the proposition of the rationality of everything which is real resolves itself into the other proposition. All that exists deserves to perish.
Before this happens, a distant and practically indifferent prospect for us, millions of years will have passed. Hundreds of thousands of generations will have peopled the earth and gone to their graves. But time moves inexorably toward that time when the thinking spirit on earth fades out in order to be reborn again somewhere else in another part of the external universe. Another fiery youth.
Does Ilyenkov believe in reincarnation? It seems so.
Well,
Oh, yes.
a side note, like, people that I know are always like, I don't want the Earth to be destroyed because, if it happens during our lifetime, that would be horrible. And as an Ilyenkovian person, I mean, I explain it to them autistically, but also I'm like, wouldn't it be cool for the world to explode? I mean, you're gonna die anyway. Nothing interesting is gonna happen in your life during your death anyway. It would be better to go out that way. They just don't want, like, the sun to explode or whatever, and swallow the earth, whatever they think.
So long as I die quickly enough. Just long enough to see the cool explosion, but quick enough that I don't
The
feel it
grand
burning
spectacle.
me.
Yeah, you'd be dead before you felt much, I'm pretty sure.
And well, considering how awful people can be, I don't have any remorse about this fact.
I mean, some of my coolest dreams are dreams of the end of the world, let me tell you.
Beautiful.
Like giant meteors, black holes, the sun swallowing the earth. I've had somewhere about 5 different apocalyptic dreams, and they're all super cool because we're all partying at the end of the world.
Yeah.
Everybody's like, "Yep, the world's gonna end." It's like, let's have a big concert or something. It's just wait until it happens.
Well, yeah, I mean, that would be the way to die. I mean, that would be the way to go, just in total ecstasy and euphoria.
Yeah, recalls Melancholia, which I agree with Zizek is a positive movie. Puts a positive spin on the end of the world. This, which is referring to the birth of the cosmos, is incontrovertible from this prospect of any viewpoint. The idea that one should feel sorrow about this would be just as ludicrous as feeling sorrow about the fact that everything in the world is interrelated, that quantity is transformed into quality, that thought cannot exist without a brain, and so on. This fact, in this way, is not a ground for an outpouring of emotion, but rather one of understanding. Okay, I didn't know he was saying that thought cannot exist without a brain. Before, I must have confused what he was saying. Yeah, I disagree with that. Obviously. But if from a practical point of view, this fact conjures up absolute indifference in us, one which can in no way influence the activities of human life. After all, an individual doesn't just fold up their arms even when they know that sooner or later they will need to abandon life. From a theoretical point of view, this prospect is certainly not without interest. So you can care about it, but not for some, dumb reason. One can't fail to note that, in some form or other, this problem has always dawned in human consciousness. In a naive and mystic formulation of this issue, known under the title of the final aims of human existence. Those highest aims by which the thinking spirit is manifested in the universe, and for which humankind, endures such suffering and torment. The answer, of course, has always had an ideological nuance. The realization of the highest moral aims of moral law, or as in Hegel, the aim of self-understanding of the world spirit. This wide variety of different variants are all known to us. Dialectical materialism for the first time rationally sublated this formulation of this issue in such a way that it completely casts off the idea of any aim of the existence of the universe whatsoever, resolving the issue of the aim in the category of universal interaction. Humankind, with its thought hooked up to this universal interaction, is engendered within it, and is developed, and at some point disappears within it. The notion of the highest aim of human existence is sublated rationally in the understanding of the necessity of its genesis, development, and death inside and through the medium of this universal interdependence of all forms of motion and of motion of universal matter.
It's like Schelling.
Should just show this to anyone.
It's just Schelling. It's like Schelling is literally standing there with his system of identity yelling at me right now.
Yeah. The genesis and development and death of humankind is objectively predicated on this infinite system of interaction. In its understanding, one must search for the sense and role of humankind in the universe. Look for the solution to this question that, in its idealistic expression, sounds like the issue of the highest, of the final aim of human existence.
But he just said there's no aim.
Yeah, well,
no aim to the universe. Well, he said there's no aim to the universe, but there's an aim to us.
Yeah.
Which is a silly thing.
Okay. There's a short-term goal in the lifespan of the universe.
I mean, is he kind of hinting on something cyclic, or?
Oh yeah,
I don't know.
Oh yeah. The whole thing he's been hinting at is cyclic. Everything's just like life and death eternally.
Oh, cyclic. Okay, I thought you said psychic.
That too.
Yeah,
I wonder what
cyclic.
He knew about what was going on in the Soviet Union at the time. Seems he wasn't too keen on that.
The historical genesis of the history of humankind is fully explained in a rational and materialist manner by science. The biological development of a certain breed of monkey, then labor as a social form of interaction of the organism with the surrounding environment.
Then various
as a
aliens
process of
genetically modifying us.
yeah. As a process of the self-emergence of the human.
Then
Self-emergence. Self-emergence, he says. I know what he means. He means of the human as human, as a process characterized by self-development, reflected in ideological consciousness as aims imminent to humankind. Well, we got to reconnect with our forebears, right?
You mean the Atlanteans?
Yeah, sure. Why not? What, are you gonna say it, or should I?
What?
Oh, I thought you were gonna be like, well, we're the reincarnation of the Atlanteans or whatever.
No, burgers are the reincarnation. You're from
Yeah.
You're from
Oh, well,
Russia.
yeah.
I'm not from here either. So I'm
Oh,
definitely
yeah.
not a
Well, what
reincarnated
is-
Atlantean asshole.
Well, no, but okay. So what Americans? I mean, we live here. I don't know. We were destined to be here, were we not?
I don't know. I'm definitely.
Maybe.
I'm. Didn't we accept that we are just like trans Germans?
Yeah, we're trans German.
I mean, I was born
We're
in the
political
U.S.,
prisoners.
but I
Yeah.
no longer live there, and I don't consider myself American because I was not raised with American values. I was actually raised with Canadian values, since my mother is Canadian, and she despises American culture outright.
We all. So there's no true American identity. It's an abstract. It's just so abstract that like you can say this is American or this is not. I mean, there's certain boundaries, but yeah, there's no
McDonald's
set
is
America.
American.
Oh God, yeah, but America has its claws in everything. So like build a Starbucks everywhere, and then that becomes America.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, let's see. So the whole thing about the role of labor, as in the evolution of the brain and the mind. That makes sense, actually. The first time I heard it from Engels, so it's like because it comes from Engels. It's a pretty interesting insight. It's a pretty interesting idea. But I think as far as like actual archaeology and anthropology and also looking into the world of animals goes, there's not a shred of evidence that is in any way really true. Because there's plenty of animals that are tool users, tool makers as well.
Beavers.
They are not involving anywhere else. I mean, nobody knows how the development of new capacities in nature arise. The guess of ancient aliens and just like, well, it just happened with some random mutation, dude, is equally as valid. We just don't know.
What exactly is their idea again about labor?
The development of the hand, the evolution of the hand, and then the development of the capacity to make tools was part of what led to the development of the capacities of thought, of abstract thought.
There are tons of different theories, though.
Yeah, that's one of the Marxist favorite ones. But like, as far as it goes, that there is no anthropological evidence that really plays that out.
Mm-hmm.
We have no idea why the modern human evolved the brain that it did, how it evolved so rapidly, like where the hell like the advancement of abstract thought comes from. We know that there.
I like the stoned ape theory.
Yeah.
McKenna.
I mean, like at least that gave some impetus.
I just like it. I don't think it's true.
Yeah,
I just think it would be cool.
It was a cool theory, but I don't think it's true either. I mean, at least there you can like say like there's something that literally causes your brain to like rewire, and that could give you a mechanism for a certain type of mutation. But even there, you lack a capacity of explaining how the higher functions really come about. Not only that, I mean, like, really look at ancient architecture, people. I mean, I'm not saying it was aliens, because, I don't know, it could be just, like, the whole Atlantis theory. Maybe we were, like, a hell of a lot more advanced, and then we got wiped out by, like, meteors and floods.
Mm-hmm.
Or just sacred geometry. I mean, you look at those structures and you see how ordered they are. I mean, that did not happen by accident.
And the craftsmanship is just way better than anything we've ever fucking made.
Yeah. There are Stonehenges found everywhere.
There are giant blocks
Even
that
at
we couldn't even
Stonehenge,
lift
there are
today.
more things they found. Yep. Stonehenge. The earliest is Göbekli Tepe. Still no idea, but it's not a civilization necessarily. I mean, it required civilization.
But nobody knows who made it.
It was just a site, It wasn't a city or anything. Yeah.
So somehow we got really smart, then we got really stupid. And then we're back to being smart stupid.
Yeah.
But that's all irrelevant. It's all irrelevant. Back to
Catching
Ilyenkov.
up to the Atlantean. Yeah. A fully rational explanation of human self-development has been given by the teachings of Marx and Engels, their historical materialism, which did away once and for all with idealism in its last refuge.
No, it didn't.
Well, we know why he has to say this, but yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think he agrees either.
I am a Marxist, guys, I swear.
We know.
Well, I think he was, but he
The
wasn't. He
idealist
wasn't
No,
really
he
a
was.
materialist.
Yeah. it's-
Yeah. He was a
He's
Marxist,
just like,
yeah, sure.
like he
He
was trying
always-
to do earlier. He was trying to, say that the ideal is really just material.
Yeah. He's trying to go the opposite direction that we go. Materialism is really idealist. Idealist is really material. Human history now emerged as a necessary process of self-development, a moving spring located within it, in the internal contradictions of its development and not requiring any transcendent or transcendental goals for its explanation.
Well, I agree with that.
From this point of... Yeah, I agree. What were you going to say?
No, I agree with that.
Oh, okay.
The explanation of history, like as a rational history, requires no external anything. Even if it is the reptilians, like prodding us from the shadows, it doesn't matter.
Maybe. From this point of view, it would be worthwhile to sketch the prospects for the future more concretely than it has been done until now. That humanity, along with the Earth, will perish at some point in time is indisputable and needs not be questioned. The whole issue can be reduced to how precisely this will happen. What conditions make the end of humankind just as inevitable as its genesis in the fold of universal interaction? Here there immediately arises a doubt. Is it possible to formulate in some way several reasonable answers to this question? Is it possible to say anything about this apart from poetic fantasies? Probably not, but it doesn't stop people from trying. We shall try, at first, to establish and summarize all the indisputably theoretical conditions of the task, so as to observe whether they are sufficient in finding a solution that is at least one iota more concrete than the general idea that, somehow or other, the end of humankind is inevitable. The answer, naturally, can be found along the path of a more concrete analysis of that universal interaction within which the history of humankind is manifested, and which ultimately decides all the more or less distant prospects of all that exists. And so, first of all, the fate of humankind is closely linked with the future fate of Earth, and in wider terms, with the fate of the solar system. This is, as it were, the closest link of universal interaction with which directly determines the inevitable end of humankind. Therefore, most theoretical hypotheses of the end of human existence also resort to the idea that at some point in the darkness of the future, the sun will gradually cool down, and the reserves of heat on the planet will dwindle, and so humankind will, therefore, already start its path to decline. This idea, until now, remains the only conceivable one, since the end of humanity as a consequence of a tragic incident, the clash of cosmic bodies and so on, is not worth taking into account. Sorry, Nibiru's not going to come smashing into us. Well, according to him, who knows? Or one of those 40 planets in our solar system, according to Lear.
And there's no other civilization on the planet to go to war with.
Damn. For while such an incident can't be excluded, it cannot be taken as the basis for a theoretical understanding of the issue. It would be absurd to assume that the genesis of humankind is postulated on iron need, while its end is linked only to contingency. Both here and there is a place for the dialectic for both the former and the latter. Contingency itself should be understood in the case of the end of humankind, too, as a manifestation of necessary processes. In the idea of a pure accidental collision, there are no dialectics. The collision of heavenly bodies is only one of the contingent events that could take place. Here one needs such a contingency, which is not necessarily at all as such. We need to find that prospect which comes about, even if that precise, that completely unique incident doesn't take place through any other contingent event.
I mean, here
I think I agree. Yeah.
Well, I don't agree about the death of
I don't
human
know.
species. Okay, like I don't think like I
Well-
don't think there's anything imminent to life at all. Like if ETs or anything
Imminent to
go,
life?
if ETs or anything to go by, that means like that that the fate of life is to have like this total die off of life as well. It seems nobody but like morons like the Martians like really did that because they were idiots.
Yeah.
Literally the space burgers. Can't imagine why else they would have gotten into a war.
Well, I don't think that's what he's saying, though, is it?
Well, no, yeah,
just
he's saying
that
that he's saying that the
presuppose
species
the-
is going to kill it's going to die. So the question is, how it's going to die?
Yeah.
I think there
but
is a way.
It's not just purely contingent. Like, if nothing ever occurred,
Well, yeah,
like some
so,
contingent
yeah.
event never occurred, it's still going to happen at some point.
Yeah, because he's saying it's an imminently necessary thing.
Yeah.
I think, in the species sense of like literally we're gonna die, that's nonsense to me. Unless you want to die, you're not gonna die.
Yeah.
The only way like that makes sense if there is an idea of like the whole like transcendence of a species, where we literally become another species by our own design.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we find a way to become 12th dimensional some kind of beings or something.
Maybe. I don't know.
And therefore technically we are transhuman. And, humanity quote unquote died.
Sure, but that would still be life.
Yeah, that would exactly.
So
So the idea that we're gonna the species will literally die it's not imminent to it really. It's no more like imminent than like the fact that life evolved. That a species gets superseded in evolution by changing over time. Technically our.
But I do agree with his point, though, about the contingent event. Like, even if we stop one, the next ice age or whatever happens, something else will eventually happen.
Yeah, but
that could take us out.
I mean, the contingency of it is of no consequence for dialectical logic.
Yeah.
You always want to rest on something imminent.
Sure. But, like, physically, we have to find a way to preserve the planet or go to another planet before the sun dies out, because that is inevitable.
That's like billions of years. Like,
I
if
know,
we
but
can't
still,
come up with a spaceship in 1,000 years, like we
Yeah,
are idiots.
Then we deserve it. Yeah.
Like if we don't already live in space in 1,000 years, we are like one of the dumbest species of intelligent life.
Mm-hmm. Which seems not to be the case, but who knows? We could be preschool. I know you think we're preteens, but we could be preschoolers at this point. Engels, as is well known, accepted as the main dialectical prospect the hypothesis of the gradual cooling of the sun and the earth. In his description, the prospect appears like this, quote, "But inexorably the time will come when the declining warmth of the sun will no longer suffice to melt the ice thrusting itself forward from the poles. When the human race, crowding more and more about the equator, will finally no longer find even there enough heat for life. when gradually even the last trace of organic life will vanish, and the Earth, an extinct, frozen globe like the moon, will encircle in deepest darkness and in an ever narrower orbit about the equally extinct sun, and at last fall into it. End quote. Ingalls,
Nah.
1974.
I mean, a good guess for the time, but like
Pretty poetic.
completely wrong. I mean, like the sun will cool in like trillions of years. First, that it will expand and then basically swallow like the planets up to very close to the edge of the Earth. I think it's still going to be pretty hot. I mean, it's going to be big. It's going to be close. It's going to burn us more than anything. But that's not going to happen for billions of years. Not only that,
it's not gonna burn
we
up.
ought to be like even more afraid of the fact that it might just go supernova randomly, because
Oh, yeah.
supernovas are not. There is one exception that's been found in the like. Once you find an exception, the rule is broken, and we definitely don't know what causes supernovas now. It has nothing to do with the amount of fuel that there happens to be in the star. Doesn't have to do with age, because we have one example in which we saw a young star supernova, not once but twice within like a decade. So if things can go randomly supernova, that's probably the scariest thing of all.
Mm-hmm. Probably aliens turning it up for a bit.
Turning on the cosmic electric currents.
Yeah. The solar system, it appears, can expect precisely this prospect, and humankind, considering this in an abstract manner, must share this very fate with it. This is a necessary conclusion. Hold on.
I'll continue reading.
Okay.
This is a necessary conclusion following from a conception of the place of the human within the immediate environment of its existence, within the immediate environment of universal interaction. But a question arises. Aren't there any circumstantial facts that override this abstract possibility? Hasn't this prospect not been sketched out in rather too abstract a manner? The fact that the sun and the planets will cool in time is indisputable. Not really. Yet surely humankind, and in the future this will be all the more true, will cease to be the obedient toy of external circumstances. Its power increases from year to year. Humankind will find ever newer, ever more contemporary means to liberate the reserves of heat, movement, energy accumulated in other forms apart from direct solar radiation. Pyramid power.
Yeah.
And other such things.
Or what was it? Shiva's cube there.
Shiva's linga. Shiva
Yeah,
linga.
Shiva's linga. Shiva linga.
Some kind of interdimensional like reactor. According to some remote viewer who was like given the task of remote viewing like the engine room of a UFO, he's like, I don't know what I'm seeing, but I can't draw. And they're like, well, what do you think it is? He's like, it's like, imagine like, you know, these little cup telephone on a string thing you used to play with when you're like a child. And imagine that, except one of those things is in our dimension and the other side of the phone is connected to like some other weird dimension of like infinite energy. And that's how they work. Fucking free aliens have infinite free energy, and we are here suffering under capitalism.
Which is exactly why governments never want to disclose the reality of UFOs. Artificial scarcity.
Exactly, it makes perfect sense. The further humankind develops, the more and the deeper the energy hoards, the deeper they are hidden, and the more concentrated they are accumulated, and the more powerful they are, will be revealed before transforming them into the condition for its existence. And doesn't the prospect of the end of humankind from the lack of direct solar radiation appear ludicrous? Doesn't the following prospect appear ludicrous? Humankind uses energy to an increasingly full degree along with internal atomic motion, and the trend is to ever more elementary structures, and the more it penetrates into the depths of matter, the more energy it will release from there, becoming ever more independent from the ready solar warmth, and on the other hand, it would perish precisely from the lack of direct, ready solar warmth. It would, precisely at the height of its power, freeze like a helpless puppy on the frosted-up planet. I don't know. I could have a giant planetary greenhouse. I mean, here's the thing. Like, if if this actually happened and the sun just kind of like went out, don't you worry. We can literally like launch a couple of nukes into Jupiter or Saturn, and they will become
Yeah.
suns.
Oh yeah. I just don't like that he used the example of a helpless puppy. He could have used those flash frozen mammoths if he knew about them. That would have been cool.
Oh yeah, nobody can explain the
It's not
flash
just a
frozen mammoths.
Yeah, it happens to huge creatures bigger than us. Far bigger.
It still had food. It was chewing in its mouth.
Yeah. Others had food in their stomachs.
Does not the development of productive power of humankind remove the danger of perishing from cosmic freezing from the cold of intergalactic space? In any case, as a tendency of its development, human power over internal structures of matter and over the emotional energy enclosed within them is directly opposed to the prospect of perishing from a lack of energy, movement, warmth. The tendency of external nature is to deprive humans of the possibility of using the ready warmth, not created by them, of the sun. But humans themselves create the conditions of their existence, and the heat received by them from the core of matter constitutes no exception. This is also a condition of human existence, created by the very existence of humankind, and without this condition, human existence would have no place in nature. Therefore, the prospect drawn by Engels during the last century, in the light of the most recent developments of humankind, seems rather abstract and therefore invalid. It is true that it will receive less and less ready external heat, but the more it will produce itself extracting from within matter its concentrated reserves, which, and this is theoretically indisputable, are absolutely infinite in their most minute ice-covered particles swirling through intergalactic space.
Did you skip a paragraph?
Oh yeah. It would be a complete absurdity if humankind, by now possessing endonuclear supplies of energy, in a million years were to become helpless before the cold through a simple lack of heat.
I thought you were giving an explanation at first.
After all, energy emitted from the sun is not lost without a trace. It accrues, accumulates in other forms, and one simply needs to find the capability of extracting it. If only we could find the nukes to nukes. You know, like theoretically speaking, like if you could crack like an electron, you could like blow up an entire solar system, no problem.
Oh, yeah. I thought you meant to disable nukes.
Maybe.
Apparently some of them do.
And there is no doubt that humankind, especially under the threat of perishing from the cold, would be able to do this. Even now, when the threat of the sun's cooling is a very distant one in practical terms, it has already made considerable advances in this regard. One can imagine that it will be capable of what it will be capable of in the millions of years remaining before that point in time. And it is worth taking this factor into account in order to abandon the above-mentioned hypothesis. Humanity clearly will not perish from those prospects initially depicted, neither from the cold nor from the simple lack of warmth. It is evident that one needs to reject such a presupposition. But so far we have demolished the only reasoned hypothesis, a conjecture based upon an understanding of the place of humans in the fold of universal reciprocity, and have offered no new hypothesis in its place. In the same way, one needs to jettison the idea that humankind will find its end as a result of physiological degeneration, physiological regression. Physiology is that very same nature, and humans are moving toward a greater and greater power over the nature of the given matter of its activity. Extracting energy accumulated from within the elementary particles, freely turning one form of motion into others, one chemical element into others, both more as well as less complex than the original ones, and governing at the same time one's own physiological development, directing it through a viable course from the point of view of new conditions, humankind has evidently all the potential to escape the fate of freezing into death, or that of a cold and hungry death. It has, it seems, the strength to create, at least in a small part of space, an artificial environment to support it, preserving and reproducing it without the aid of the generous and giving energy of the sun. By now, this has become a fully outlined trend in human development. But that which humankind is thinking matter in general is not is not in a condition to endure in spite of its power over nature. Whatever the level that its power reaches is the opposite state of universal matter to the cold of intergalactic space, a state toward which the evolution of the world leads it just as inevitably as that of cooling. The fiery incandescent youth of cosmic matter, the state of incandescent gas of the young, engendered nebula, a starting point for a new cosmic cycle. This fiery, vaporous condition in which all elements are transformed into wildly rotating vortices, and where it is fundamentally impossible to preserve any artificially created borders at all, from behind which humans could hide, no arbitrarily durable and heat-resistant husk, capable of separating an artificial environment from that which remains, from the non-humanized world, evidently turns out to be that absolute border beyond which the existence of thinking matter is already impossible. Maybe humankind is able to avoid death in the ice-covered planet. This is a prospect that is fundamentally possible, but no efforts will save it from death in the hurricane of global fire that at some point will return the volcanic youth to our global island.
Here we are.
Thus, we should probably see such an absolute boundary in the state of incandescent vapors to which any cosmic system will inevitably pass through in the course of a big circle if the frozen nature of the cooling universal space does not represent this absolute boundary for the existence of thinking matter. This, of course, does not exclude in any way the prospect that in certain cases it too may be the direct cause of the death of humankind, just as the accidental tragic collision of celestial bodies may also be. The demise, perishing, and disappearance of thinking matter also remains in this case irreversible. The principles of dialectics and materialism are fully preserved here too. But the concrete picture of this end turns out to be rather different. Above all, the boundaries of the existence of thinking matter extend somewhat in time. The inevitable end will come from this perspective somewhat later, although this somewhat later in reality means in excess of millions of years. And for this supplementary period, humankind undoubtedly can reinforce even further its power over nature, and reach such peaks of power that it's presently impossible to imagine even with the aid of the most unrestrained poetical fancy. But, and this is central, a theoretically very significant circumstance is effectively included among the conditions for solving the problem, about which one could fail to note when presupposing that humankind would perish from the cold and the freezing earth hovering around an ice-covered sun, but which now returns to the foreground. This is a question about the circumstances at which the cooling universal matter will necessarily transform itself into a state of incandescent nebula, turning into a massive hurricane heated up to millions of degrees Celsius and gathering at its center all the dispersed radiated reserves of motion, and thereby giving new life to the universal matter of cosmic space, expiring in the icy desert of the so-called thermal death. The origin of this new cycle of development of cosmic matter is the point in which the dispersed matter by means of irradiated stars and their intrinsic motion have again, in some way, concentrated in the form of an incandescent rotating nebula, concentrating at its center all the particles and motional energy previously dispersed in space. This turns out to be the absolute boundary in which all conditions under which the thinking spirit can exist inevitably disappear. The end of thinking matter coincides in time and according to circumstances with the beginning of a new developmental cycle of matter in cosmic expanses, from the point in which the fiery rebirth of dying worlds takes place. This point in which matter and motion, irretrievably lost thanks to their emission, in some way once again becomes concentrated and accumulates in the form of incandescent clots, hurricane-like whirling gas and vapors, proves to be that point in which thinking matter must disappear in an absolutely obligatory manner. But that same question about the concrete picture of the end of humankind, the disappearance of thinking matter, is raised in connection with those natural conditions in which the process whereby worlds dying from thermal death are reborn to a new life becomes possible and even inevitable. In other words, the conditions of a fiery rebirth of cosmic systems turns out to be, simultaneously, the conditions under which the death of thinking matter, the death of thinking spirit, finally becomes absolutely inevitable. Both problems effectively merge into one. And the most interesting aspect is that each of these issues, considered separately, when abstracted from the other, is still unresolved by science, and in this lies our hypothesis, are fundamentally unresolvable using such an approach. We have established that the question of the death of the thinking brain cannot be resolved outside the conditions created by the development of the cosmic systems within which flow the history of thinking spirit's development, and we have come to the conclusion that the absolute inevitability of this death coincides with the beginning of the fiery rebirth of worlds perishing from thermal death. We shall look at the question now from another perspective, from that of the particular destinies of cosmic systems. Does it not seem that this problem is fundamentally unresolvable unless we investigate those factors introduced by the course of the universal process of thinking spirit, those conditions which are created with their indispensable participation? In other words, does it not seem that both this and the other process are impossible to understand without considering their interaction with the other? Does it not seem that the process of the fiery rebirth of worlds, expiring in the conditions of thermal death at the same time, cannot be understood without considering the active role of the thinking spirit in the big universal circle, in precisely the same way as the death of the spirit cannot be understood outside its links to this cosmic process? We shall analyze in a more detailed manner the conditions of the theoretical task proceeding this time, not from problems of thought, but from cosmic conditions themselves, from the pure immanent laws of self-development and the death of the cosmic systems within which is born, blossoms, and then fades the highest creation of the universe, its thinking spirit. That the fate of the thinking spirit is conditioned by the fates of wider cosmic processes, this too we thereby set down at the very basis of our hypothesis. But it is here precisely that we find ourselves before an issue which hitherto has been unresolved, and perhaps unresolvable from that perspective from which it has viewed up until now. This is the problem of the so-called thermal death of the universe. This problem may be briefly expressed in the following way. All the celestial bodies and systems known to science, gradually, through emission, lose the reserve of their internal energy, and lose them irrevocably, gradually cooling in the vain attempt to heat at least to a billionth part of a degree of its surrounding environment. In so doing, the moving matter of the warmed celestial bodies disperse equally into intergalactic space, turning into cold vapors formed of ice, the temperature of which is comparable to absolute zero, and only differs from it in its vanishingly small size. The process connected with the emission of heat in the universal space can, at this point, be deemed irrevocable, moreover absolutely irrevocable, so that it seems that there is a tendency toward the fact that the entire universal matter, with its intrinsic motion, is shared in absolutely equal parts in the intergalactic sphere, and the entire universe, which as a whole gradually moves toward a condition of thermal death, that is, to that stable equilibrium that excludes every possibility of a reverse transition toward a differentiated state. At the end of last century, Rudolf Clausius even calculated that 453 out of 454 parts of the active motional energy of universal matter has already been lost on its path so far. All the remaining share of active energy has already, according to his calculations, been transformed into a highly concentrated state, into a singular state equal to itself of thermal death. From the philosophical and theoretical perspective, this is, as Engels has already demonstrated, an absurdity that presupposes the origin of the world, but hitherto the reverse process has not been revealed nor explained. Only one thing is clear. If it had not taken place somewhere and in some way, then the universe as a whole could not have existed, and on account of the infinity of time, it would already have long ago turned into an undifferentiated nebula, whose temperature in all its parts would be absolutely equal, and whose motion absolutely equally shared among all particles of matter, each of which would thus be practically immobile and would not interact with neighbors in any other way except in a purely mechanical one. Only the process that has a tendency to precisely Such a lifeless state of universal matter is known to us, whereas the reverse trend, contradicting the above process, is unknown to us, a process by means of which the reverse reallocation of motion takes place in the universe. Although theoretically it is absolutely clear that such a process does exist, indeed its existence is not in doubt. Substantially, things can be represented like this. With the exception of an infinitesimal portion, the heat of the innumerable suns of our island universe vanishes into space and fails to raise the temperature of universal space even by a millionth of a degree centigrade. What becomes of all this enormous quantity of heat? Is it forever dissipated in the attempt to heat universal space? Has it ceased to exist practically, and does it only continue to exist theoretically, in the fact that universal space has become warmer by a decimal fraction of a degree beginning with 10 or more knots? Engels, 1974. It is clear in theory that this is not the case, that the equally cooled matter of intergalactic space, into which any celestial body will gradually be transformed into due to emission in some way, and this way can only be a natural way, concentrates in a reverse way in clusters of highly incandescent gas. In so doing, it engenders new stars, new worlds, new planetary systems. But how this happens in a real and concrete way, in what manner, still remains an open mystery. A theoretical issue which, as Engels demonstrated, can only be resolved provided that it is clearly set out, and that the way it is set out as assumes a dialectical materialist view of things. From the perspective of materialist dialectics, the question must and can only be set out in this way. When it has been shown how the heat radiated into universal space becomes utilizable again, the theory of the transformation of motion puts this question categorically, and it cannot be got over by postponing the answer or by evasion. That, however, with the posing of the question, the conditions for its solutions are simultaneously given. This is self-evident. Engels, 1974. We have formulated this condition above. The solution must be based on theoretically indisputable conditions, that the reverse process, the process of a concentration of dispersed motion in clusters of incandescent gas, taking place in some way, somewhere, in some permanent manner, in the fold of the universe, and comprising its constant inner condition of existence. And the whole issue consists in establishing, in discovering this process. No wonder that it has not yet been solved, Engels continues. It may still be a long time before we arrive at a solution with our small means, but it will be solved, just as surely as it is certain that there are no miracles in nature, and that the original heat of the nebular ball is not communicated to it miraculously from outside the universe. Sure. But what if it's communicated to it by an outside dimension? I don't know. Doesn't all that stuff? Once you get into it, it's just like, well, what? We should note that even nowadays, in the middle of the 20th century, this question has still not been resolved, just as it had not been at the end of the 19th century. The general statement that the general quantity of motion is infinite, that is, inexhaustible, is also ineffective in overcoming our difficulties in each separate case. Here too, following such a path, we will also not arrive at the rebirth of dying worlds, with the exclusion of those cases provided for in the aforementioned hypotheses, in which are always connected to the loss of energy, that is, only temporary cases. The big circle here is not arrived at, and will not be arrived at, until such a time that it reveals the potential for a new use of emitted heat. This question, thus, should not concern itself with individual cases, but must be resolved in connection with the universal, big circle of universal matter. This big circle in itself, within its attributive and necessary cycles, must necessarily lead to the rebirth of dying worlds in the form of incandescent nebula. But what about black holes? Bet you never thought of that. Therefore, one should seek to solve the riddle not only in a concrete and physical, concrete astronomical form, but also in a general philosophical form. In other words, the possibility and necessity of such a rebirth should be demonstrated and sought within, in the attributive and necessary form of the existence of universal matter, not outside it and not in contingent events which concern only single cases. For in these separate cases the problem may well even be resolved, but it still remains unresolved in a general sense. Thus the problem in general terms can be encapsulated like this. Physics and astronomy thus far hold data concerning the process of dispersion of matter and the motion of stellar bodies, a process tending to lead to the state of so-called thermal death. The concept of so-called thermal death is nothing other than the theoretical expression of the tendency of the process connected with the emission of heat and light in intergalactic space. But natural science research has still not yet demonstrated the reverse process, the process of the rebirth of dying worlds, the process of transformation of ice-covered steam of intergalactic space into incandescent nebula. An indisputable theoretical conclusion is that such a process, through some spontaneous way intrinsic to the very nature of moving matter, is continuously taking place. Without such a process, the existing universe could not be preserved and reproduced in eternity in a natural way. It represents an absolute necessity, inherently posited by the motion of universal matter, a condition for the existence of the universe. Without this process, then, there exists God, the origin of the universe, the first impulse leading matter from a practically immobile state of thermal death, and all such devilish dribble and mysticism. Apart from this, the idea that the entropy of the world cannot be eliminated in a natural way, but on the contrary can be created, this is the idea of thermal death, expressed in terms of thermodynamics, is equivalent to the denial of universal law of the preservation and transformation of energy. This idea assumes, as Engels has shown, that energy active motion is dispersed if it is not quantitative but qualitative. I don't know, man. I don't know. The thing about the whole God and the origin of the universe and the first impulse, and the something like Aristotle's unmoved mover.
Yeah.
It's technically spooky, but it's also technically not. From whence does the motion of motion come? Well, it sure doesn't come from the natural world, that's for sure. I mean, it seems like a bit of nonsense, but at the same time, it's not really nonsense. You know, this need to ground this whole thing in like, oh, it's just all about nature. Well, nature is just the spatial embodiment of certain things. You know, when you ask, well, where do the principles of nature come from? Where does the moviness of moving come from? Well, it doesn't come from itself, that's for sure. Therefore, some sort of quote-unquote supernatural source has to be sought. That's just that's just a necessary logical case. You know, you just can't ground nature in nature entirely. It doesn't make sense. So I mean, the idea of like just constant emergence, dissipation, and generation in the universe makes sense. You don't have to have like this just one-way ticket of like a mechanical process, because mechanism can't explain everything of that sort either. Mechanism, for example, does not explain gravity. Mechanism does not really explain electromagnetism. Mechanism doesn't explain chemistry. There's tons of things which mechanism alone does not explain. You know, I mean, hell, we don't even understand how in the hell an electron doesn't fall into the atomic nucleus, even though the atomic nucleus is positive. Somehow it circles around it, but it doesn't fall into it, which is exactly what you think would happen.
Because of the laws of attraction?
Well, yeah,
Or what?
because of the laws of attraction, you'd expect the electron to fall into the nucleus where the proton is, but it doesn't. And nobody knows why. You know, you can posit some stupid shit like, oh, well, it's the nuclear force. That's bullshit. Oh no, that's not what the nuclear force is used for. Nuclear force is used for explaining, you know, how the atomic nucleus stays together. Despite the fact that if you have a bunch of protons and a bunch of neutrons, it doesn't make sense why it would stay together and why it holds together so strongly. That's a strong nuclear force. I forget what the weak nuclear force is for, but it's for some other autistic thing. I forget where I was going with that, so never mind it.
It just doesn't fall into it. It just doesn't explain. I forget what the explanation was. You used it as an example for something.
I was just saying that
Oh, God, or whatever, you know,
mechanism
creation.
and
The external force of
natural
nature.
Yeah, natural relations and
From
motions
nature, I mean.
themselves
Yeah.
are inexplicable in terms of the natural things.
Because he's assuming that nature grounds itself.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he has to. You know, it's not like he could admit that there are quite literally supernatural and subnatural domains in which, you know, the origin of these things would themselves have to be grounded. It's all metaphysics, man. The law of preservation and transformation of energy assumes that energy can only be preserved in the course of its qualitative transformations, and this course cannot be a one-sided process, irrevocable in any one of its links. All forms of motion of matter in some way or other reciprocally transforms itself into others. They are reciprocally reversible. If this had not been the case, then the universe existing today would not have been able to exist without the constant interference of supernatural forces, while the law of preservation of matter in motion would have turned into a fiction. Is not the will a supernatural force? I think so. Therefore, the whole problem consists of explaining and showing through what path, by what natural way, can the heat emitted into universal space be used, or in how this dispersed emission of matter in motion once again accumulates in such a form which is capable, conversely, of transforming itself into extraordinarily heated and compacted agglomerations in world islands of incandescent gas, drawing to its center all practically immobile matter dispersed into the surrounding spaces and building from it its body, a body of future stars, suns, planetary systems, and so on. Here we will allow ourselves to state our hypothetical thesis regarding the where and the how of this process, which regularly returns universal matter from the state of thermal death into a state of incandescent clouds of gas, and is carried out with a necessity inherent in the very nature of moving matter. The hypothesis consists of the following. Why not presuppose that this reverse process takes place with the participation of thinking matter, thinking spirit, as one of the attributes of universal matter, and that without its contribution, without its help, this process would be impossible and inconceivable? This conjecture does not affect or undermine even in the most minimal way, a single, even the most insignificant principle of materialism and materialist dialectics. In actual fact, the thinking spirit remains the highest product of matter's development, its necessary generation, its attribute. The development of the brain's thinking matter remains intertwined in the chain of universal material interaction, and it is contingent upon and defined by this interaction in general and as a whole.
Yeah, to disagree with him requires to think, so check me.
Matter as substance, in line with this presupposition, remains, according to the nature of things, primary. The necessary process of its development to some degree engenders the thinking brain as an attribute. The thinking matter of the brain, as the supreme form of motion of universal matter, doesn't engender anything supernatural. On the contrary, its death appears as a simple transformation into other, more elementary forms of motion. Its death emerges as the engendering of a new forms of motion of matter. The only new aspects to which our hypothesis leads us consists solely in the fact that the death of thinking matter is necessarily connected to the transformation of cooling matter of intergalactic space into an incandescent nebula and represents a necessary factor in this latter process. Nothing anti-materialistic, nor even non-materialistic, is brought into the concept of this process by this hypothesis. Thought itself is a natural process, and there is nothing surprising in that it, as such, takes place within other natural processes, and in turn it actually affects their course. Indeed, dialectical and historical materialism in no way deny the reverse impact of thought on material processes. In this given case, we are dealing with one of the concrete forms of such a reverse active impact, nothing more. In this way, all the principles of dialectics and materialism not only are not brought into question, but on the contrary are posited at the foundation of the hypothesis. Moreover, a whole array of philosophical and theoretical tenets of dialectical materialism acquire under these conditions a rather more concrete form of expression, not to mention the fact that the question of the entropy of the world is essentially resolved. In actual fact, if the thinking matter of the brain is the same matter, then thought, observed not in its narrow gnosiological aspect, but in terms of its place and role among other forms of motion and development of matter, is also a form of the motion of matter. Moreover, it is its supreme form. Motion is not merely change of place. In fields higher than mechanics, it is also change of quality. Yeah, no, you're full of shit, Engels. Then there is nothing out of bounds in the fact that thought is regarded, from the perspective of the universal process of the quantitative and qualitative transformations of some forms of motion to others, as one of the links of a universal big circle universal matter, as one of the forms into which all other forms transform themselves, and which in reverse turns into other forms or contributes to their reciprocal transformation. Okay, just as an aside, I was joking about Engels being wrong. Engels may actually be right, and he may be right in the worst ways that he could have not wished for.
Explain.
Because one of the things that people hear a lot, either from the aliens or which are God knows what, people think they're either higher interdimensional beings of some sort, and all the aliens harp on about one of their biggest things is you gotta up your frequency, you gotta up your vibration, increase your vibration, because otherwise you're gonna be stuck with pig disgusting 3D forever, and that sucks. If you can somehow vibrate your brain, and therefore meaning your thought, and therefore meaning your spirit, faster somehow, you make it to all the other higher dimensions. It's like the frequency of the reception of your brain. You're changing the frequency on the dial of a radio and tuning in to higher realities of sorts. So if you're dying in this one, you're like, oh man, the sun's about to burn. Just increase your motion, and you'll increase the quality of your life, quite literally. And you blip into the 11th dimension. You're like, well, yeah, Earth is gone and dead, but hey, the 11th dimension is all right. I mean, there's a whole theory on that, which I think is about as valid as the idea of well, it's just your brain. if not slightly more valid, because of this weird things that people experience despite their brains being non-functional at certain times. It's the idea that just the brain is a receiver of consciousness, whatever in the hell that means and implies. No idea what that really implies. It could imply a whole slew of many things. I don't quite think it makes sense to believe that implies that there is like some dimension where like consciousness resides. Although there is a sense in which that does make sense. But it's not talking about like any
realm of thought.
Yeah, I mean literally the realm of thought. It's not like it's another space or place. Well, it is and it isn't. I mean literally, I mean like there is a space of your thoughts, but
there's a world inside your head.
I mean it's like but it's not of the same kind, so to say, as the world out there. And I don't know, in its purity, it's kind of a more fun, but also not as fun. A lot of terrifying shit's hiding in there.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, like this is it's a really popular idea amongst people who do a shitload of acid and other related drugs. It's also an idea that's pretty common with people who do some acid and are into like spiritual meditations and whatnot. And it sort of makes sense. The idea of vibration makes sense. It's quite literally true. When you get into these states of mind, like your brain frequency changes. The usual frequency. I think that meditation happens in. It happens in the weird, interesting parts of experiences.
Is it like the delta waves?
Yeah,
or
it's like something like
that?
delta waves, something like 7 to 10 hertz. And that's where like interesting experiences of the mind, of the conscious mind, occur in. So there's something to that. I mean, literally, quantity turns into quality. Angles, you radical motherfucker, you were right, but you probably hate it.
Is that what the Beach Boys meant by good vibrations?
There's a whole lot of things about vibrations, sound, and it's literally ontological sound, but it's vibrations.
Yeah. Maybe they really were picking up good vibration. I read a thing today about brain linkage and stuff, which was interesting, but we should go on this. It's tangentially related, but we can talk about it later.
In these circumstances, just as the thinking matter of the brain is the supreme part of universal development, so it is reasonable to assume that across the universal big circle and the mutual transformations of one form of motion, universal matter, into others, it has a special place and plays a special role, such a role which cannot be played by other, less complexly organized forms of motion. And this special role, befitting its place in the system of forms of motion of universal matter as a supreme form of motion, is outlined in our hypothesis. In real terms, this role can be represented thus. Humankind, or some other combination of thinking beings, at some very high point of its development, at the point acquired when matter, or more or less vast cosmic spaces within which humankind exists, starts to cool and is close to the condition of so-called thermal death, in this fateful point for matter, and in which, in some way or other, unknown to us, of course, living at the dawn of the history of human power, consciously facilitates the start of the reverse in comparison with dispersed motion, a process transforming the dying, freezing worlds into the fiery, incandescent hurricane of emerging nebula. In these conditions, the thinking spirit sacrifices itself, and in this process is not able to preserve itself, but its sacrifice takes place in the name of its duty to Mother Nature. The human, a thinking spirit, returns its old debt to nature. At some point in its youth, nature engendered the thinking spirit. Now, on the contrary, the thinking spirit, at the cost of its own existence, returns to Mother Nature, dying of thermal death, a new incandescent youth, a state in which it is able once again to start a colossal developmental to start colossal development cycles, which at some point again, at a different point in time and space, will once more lead to the emergence of a new thinking brain, a new thinking spirit from its cooling core.
I love how he's talking about human intervention in the literal fate of the universe.
Yep.
I mean, I don't want to go into some big theology rant here, but it's kind of like the opposite of tikkun, if you're familiar with that whole concept, that our job as Jews is to elevate everything down here back to God, and it's kind of going from, well, God, everything emanates from God, and then we have to pick it back up. That's kind of a cartoonish way of explaining it, and elevate it back up to God higher. And here he's talking about taking, the highest thing is the human mind, and it's our job to bring everything back to the lowest point, back to nature. I think that's kind of funny.
Well, yeah, because it's like so far from the lowest point that it's gotta get a kickstart again.
Oh, yes.
From this perspective, the definition of thought as an actual attribute and not only mode of matter is understood. Contrariwise, thought cannot be qualified as attribute. Indeed, the concept of an attribute includes the idea that the given form of motion of matter represents an absolutely necessary product of its existence, therefore an absolutely necessary condition, not able to disappear of its infinite existence. So thought is there in the beginning, it's there in the middle, and it's there at the end. In other words, a characteristic of thought as attribute presupposes that it, as the highest form of motion, is an absolutely necessary link through which matter passes all the time, again and again in each of its finite cycles of its colossal big circle, such a form which this big circle reproduces again and again with an iron necessity intrinsic to its nature.
Yeah, talking about going back to the source. We have to bring everything right back. Unless I'm misunderstanding him there.
Yeah, in a way, yeah.
Yeah, I apologize.
I think that's kind of what he's getting at. It's not so much the source, but it's like just kick-starting the whole cycle again.
The cycle, yeah.
And I mean, like, it seems like what he's implying, it's like an atom bomb, but not with like matter, but with thought. It's like you thought there was power in splitting, a particle of matter. Imagine when you split a thought.
So what Ilyenkov wants is a revolution in the literal sense, but
Yep.
not literally.
A revolution in the cycle of the universe. Just one more revolution in the cycle.
End the Kali Yuga, bring us back to the Satya Yuga. Ilyenkov confirmed for Hindu.
I wouldn't be surprised if he had read that, because the Cosmos had similar I don't think they were particularly strongly influenced, but they must have been aware of these things. It was the rage around that time. Well, especially with the Germans, but probably.
Well, that would be a great way to troll tankies. Tell them that Soviet Daimot is Hindu.
The Maoists would like that.
No, Mao was a Taoist and Buddhist. But yeah, I mean, Dharmic religion, so kind of all flows.
Alright, consequently, the appearance of the thinking spirit within the framework of the big universal circle is not at all something accidental that, pari passu, could simply not exist, but an internal and assumed condition of its own realization. Otherwise, it is not an attribute, but only a mode. Indeed, if one assumes that thinking spirit is born somewhere on the periphery of universal matter only in order for it soon to vanish fruitlessly and without a trace, flaring up for a brief moment on a cooling planet only in order to be extinguished again, leaving in its wake only wrecks of material culture that just as quickly disperse in the universe the stream of its perpetual motion. If one assumes such a fate for the thinking spirit, then one ends up with a very strange notion of an attribute. Sounds a bit of a formalism that he's going with, but I mean, I have no idea about Spinozism, so yeah. Indeed, in this case, thought turns out to be something like mold on a cooling planet. Something like the sensile disease of matter, a certain and certainly not the highest flower of creation, not the highest product of universal world development. In this case, thought, even if it is still called the highest flowering of matter, the flower turns out to be barren, a beautiful but absolutely infertile flower, blossoming somewhere in the periphery of universal development only in order to instantly fade under the icy or the fiery incandescent gust of a hurricane from the infinite universe. All the effective development of universal matter in this case takes place alongside its development, completely autonomous from it, and its appearance has absolutely no influence on the destiny of universal development. Thought turns into an absolutely infertile episode which, pari passu, would also not have happened at all without any detriment to everything else. Hardly does such a role correspond with the place of thought in the system of universal matter's form of motion. The highest form of its motion cannot be its most infertile and its most useless. There is far more basis to assume that thinking matter as the highest quality of form of motion of universal matter plays a by no means unimportant role in the process of the universal big circle, or a role corresponding to the complexity and the eminence of its organization. Why not assume in this case that thought is precisely that most qualitatively peak form in which is realized the accumulation and productive use of energy emitted by the suns? That is, this same link which as yet is lacking in order for an actual big circle to be possible, and not a one-sided and irrevocable process of dispersal of matter in motion in intergalactic space. Why not presuppose that matter in its development specifically creates with the aid and in the form of the thinking brain those same conditions in the presence of which the emitted energy from the sun isn't fruitlessly wasted on the simple heating of universal space, but accumulates into the qualitatively highest form of its existence, and then is used like a rigger hook as a detonator originating in the process of reverse rebirth of dying worlds in the form of incandescent nebula. Indeed, and in this qualitatively higher form of motion accumulated in the form of material culture, in the form of the power of thinking beings over dead matter, in the form of thought and its product, in this qualitatively higher form of motion, it transforms a tiny fraction of heat radiated from the suns in the cosmic space. The quantitative minuteness of this share fully compensates that which it accumulates in a qualitatively higher form, in such a way by which nature itself, without the mediation of thought, cannot transform an infertilely dissipated emitted warmth. Humankind is already able to release those reserves of motion which, without its knowledge, would have remained connected and dead in nuclear structures. That in a hypothesis according to which the future of humankind turns out to be capable of releasing from its bound state such a quantity of energy that would be sufficient to transform the cooling matter of our cosmic island into an ocean of incandescent vapors. In this hypothesis, there is already nothing astonishing and mystical. So, universal nuclear conflagration. Which apparently is like one of the shittiest forms of energy.
What?
Well, nukes. Like nuclear energy is just like
nuclear.
at least fission is definitely really not very economical. Like, well, I mean, it's more economical than coal, but it's it in itself compared to other things that we have discovered is not that economical. We just don't know how to control these other things that we have discovered. Like, for example, there are things I've done with plasma experiments in which they don't know how in the world these where they zap a plasma and they charge it up and then they get a probe close to it trying to measure it, and then once you get to close just a specific amount the distance from it there is an immense discharge of energy the likes of which is unexplainable by just what was input there. So we have like it. I mean, it's like the efficiency compared to a nuke is immense. So if you could like somehow harness like whatever the hell that is, that's pretty crazy. The material and spiritual culture of thinking beings that is very rarely manifested in nature and that requires extraordinarily specific conditions for its appearance, and proves to be that form of motion through which there takes place a concentrated accumulation of heat emitted by suns, a heat that is abortively dissipated via all other channels, and that only in this form is again used as a means, a method, of the fiery rebirth of the freezing areas of the large universe. In concrete terms, one can imagine it like this. At some peak point of their development, thinking beings executing their cosmological duty and sacrificing themselves produce a conscious cosmic catastrophe, provoking a process, a reverse thermal dying of cosmic matter, that is, provoking a process leading to the rebirth of dying worlds by means of a cosmic cloud of incandescent gas and vapors. In simple terms, thought turns out to be a necessary mediating link, thanks only to which the fiery rejuvenation of the universal matter becomes possible. It proves to be this direct, efficient cause that leads to the instant activation of endless reserves of interconnected motion, and in a similar manner to how it currently initiates a chain reaction, artificially destroying a small quantity of the core of radioactive material. In this given case, the process apparently will also have a chain-like form, that is, a reaction, one that self-produces itself in a spiral-like way, a reaction that creates along with its own particular course the conditions for its own flux and its expanding at every moment scale. Only in this given case does the chain reaction spread not through the artificially accumulated reserves of radioactive material, but through the naturally accumulated reserves of motion of the universe, on the reserves connected with the condition of the thermal death of the universal space. In simple terms, this act materializes in the guise of a colossal cosmic explosion, having a chain-like character in the matter of which the explosive mass emerges as the totality of elementary structures is dispersed by emissions through the whole universal space. From the perspective of contemporary physics, this does not appear at all inconceivable. Indeed, it is clear that the smaller the artificially destructible structure, the greater the reserves of internal energy that are released during its destruction. The destruction of chemical structures, which happens by simply burning them, gives a comparatively small dose of released energy. An incomparably greater quantity of energy is released with the destruction of the atomic core. The simpler the structure to be destroyed, the greater the quantity of energy that is extracted, indicating that the smaller and simpler the structure of matter, the more durable its interconnections, then the harder it is to destroy, but the greater the energy it obtains in the case that one manages to provoke a chain reaction. If one can draw the prospect of the development of science and technology in the future, then the trend is clear. Humankind is moving in the direction of a chain destruction of ever simpler and at the same time ever more durable structures of matter, releasing in the process a greater and greater quantity of energy connected with these structures. And however large the loss of energy needed to destroy the first particle, that is, to initiate this chain reaction, this loss does not compare at all to the general quantity of motion extracted during the chain reaction. And the general prospect is the following. An infinitely small structural unit of matter would, in exchange, obtain a proportionally infinite quantity of energy during its release, a quantity that is sufficient to destroy and transform into incandescent vapors an infinitely large mass of cooling matter. And he's right about that one. It's one of the paradoxes of matter. Like the smaller the piece of matter, like the more dense in energy it is, in like orders of magnitude, which is strange. Like if you could split a quark, you could probably like blow up an entire like sector of the galaxy. And it's mainly because of exactly that chain reactive effect, that it's like a bullet that just a shrapnel that just goes into everything that's next to it, and also makes it blow up. So the old formulation of the existence of the law of the preservation of matter and motion stated by Leibniz finds its confirmation in a new light. If a minute speck of dust were destroyed, then the whole universe would collapse. The whole infinite universe cannot, of course, be destroyed by such an act, but insofar as the destroyed structure, in terms of its measure and complexity of organization, tends to a vanishingly small limit, then the quantity of energy released in this case tends to infinity. The field of universal matter, grasped by the process and included in the chain reaction, remains therefore limited by some border. What these limits are is, of course, impossible to say now, just as it is impossible to indicate the measure and qualitative characteristics of that particle whose destruction is necessary for it to trigger this process. But this process fully explains the possibility of transforming an arbitrarily large final mass of cooling matter into an incandescent nebula capable of engendering a new world. From this perspective, apparently, the hypothesis bears up to fundamental criticism. Thought, as a result, also emerges as the very link in the universal big circle, through which the development of universal matter is contained in this form of the big circle. In an image of a snake biting its tail, as Hegel loved to express the image of true as opposed to bad infinity. The task in this way has been resolved while observing all the conditions. Not one principle of materialism has been affected. Several theses of dialectics have acquired an even more concrete form of expression. Thought conceived as an actual attribute of matter, as the highest product of universal development, as the highest creation of matter that blossoms with necessity in its fold and in addition gives the necessary fruits from the perspective of universal development. The law of preservation and transformation of matter and motion has also been observed and concretely realized, and along with this, a possible path has been shown in which the use of emitted heat by the stars takes place to reverse the process, a process of concentration of matter and motion in a toughened and heated nebula in an incandescent rotating mass of gas. But that which is no less important and interesting from the perspective of the reciprocity of matter and thought. Thought, the thinking spirit, is assigned by this hypothesis such a role in the course of the universal big circle, which to a far greater degree corresponds to his position on the ladder of development, than the notion of corresponding to which all the development of spiritual and material culture, all the history of the thinking spirit, leads to a zero outcome, to simple death, leaving no remaining traces. Can you read up here?
Sure, I can read. Of course I can read. I've read many things.
Would you read?
Oh, I went away and I don't know where we are.
187.
Bottom 187.
187?
The very bottom.
Alright. The hypothesis premise?
Yep.
The hypothesis premised on the place and role that the thinking spirit necessarily plays in the system of universal interaction of universal matter, taking account of objective and other circumstances emerging in the universe that reach beyond will and consciousness, providing an insight into that same highest and final goal of the existence of the thinking spirit in the system of the universe, upon which all and every kind of religion has always speculated. This final goal itself is understood as inherently an achievable consciousness, reflecting the place of the thinking spirit in the system of objective conditions assumed by the development of universal matter. And this objectively derived goal is endlessly greater and more majestic than all those pathetic fantasies that have been invented by religions and those philosophic systems linked with them. The highest and final goal of the existence of the thinking spirit turns out to be cosmic and grand as well as sublime and wonderful. It differs from other hypotheses concerning the end of humankind not in that, through this end, it puts to an end universal death, perishing death, destruction represent an absolutely necessary result in any hypothesis. But only that death is outlined by it, not as a senseless and fruitless end, but as an act which in its essence is a creative one, as a prelude to a new cycle of life for the universe. Such a meaning for humankind and such significance of its death cannot evidently be recognized in any other hypothesis. Death indeed is all the same inevitable, and its inevitability cannot not be recognized by any hypothesis in this. And the single difference between the possible hypotheses consists only of the different interpretations of objective meaning and the role of the act of perishing in the fold of the universal big circle of universal matter, the place and role of this act in the system of universal interaction. The suggested hypothesis sets itself apart with the advantage that the death of humankind, and the thinking spirit in general, stands in this light not as senseless, as in any other possible hypothesis, but as justified as an absolutely necessary act from the perspective of universal the big circle of universal mirovoi matter developing according to its objective laws. The difference there, universal subsha is like world, I think, or maybe the opposite, universe, and circle of universal matter is world matter. This being said, thought remains a historically transitional episode in the development of the universe, a derivative, secondary product of the development of matter, but a product that is absolutely necessary, a consequence that simultaneously becomes the condition for the existence of infinite matter. In regard to matter and thought, there appears an effective dialectics, a reciprocal dependence, inside of which matter, although it remains primary and determinate, the first in nature, nonetheless turns out as conditional upon the reverse active impact of thought. Thought turns out to be an actual attribute and thesis. Quote, just as there is no thought without matter, so there is no matter without thought, acquires a real, concrete sense. A real and concrete sense. In this light, thought appears as not only the highest and most wonderful flower of the universe, but also a flower which is not infertile, as a flower that through its death engenders an absolutely necessary fruit, resulting from the perspective of the universal big circle. The death of the thinking spirit becomes a genuinely creative act, an action that transforms the freezing deserts of intergalactic space, immersed in gloom, into rotating masses of incandescent, bright, warm, sunny worlds. A system that becomes the cradle of new life, a new dawn of the thinking spirit, immortal like matter itself. The death of the thinking spirit becomes in this way its immortality, and somewhere again, in the endlessly distant future, new beings in which nature evolves a thinking spirit will, like us today, contemplate the world of stars shining in the sky of their earth, with the proud consciousness that these worlds owe their existence to a once vanishing thinking spirit, its great and fine victim. In the radiance of the starry sky, the thinking being will see a testimony to the power and beauty of the immortal, even in the death of its thinking spirit, objectified, sensually perceptible, but not calling into any doubt its own power over the sensible world. The starry sky, just like the entire surrounding nature, will be for the thinking being a mirror in which it will reflect its own infinite nature. Through the glowing of the stars, the thinking spirit will be spoken to, in a language understood only by him, the immortal thinking spirit eternally revived in its products. And in the contemplation of eternal nature, man, like every thinking being, will feel a pride in itself, of the cosmic scale of its own universal and historical mission, the place and role of the thinking being in the system of universal interaction. Conscious of the colossal scale of its role in the universe, the human being discovers also the high sensation of their highest purpose, the highest goals of its existence in the world. Its activity is filled with new pathos, before which the pathetic pathos of religion will fade. This will be a pathos of truth, a pathos of the true consciousness of its objective role in the universal system. It is clear that to fulfill its universal and historical mission, the thinking spirit will find this condition only during the peak of its development, of its power, to that point which we, people of the 20th century, will obviously not live to see, and 21st as well. Millions of years will pass, thousands of generations will be born and go to their graves, a genuine human system will be established on Earth, with the conditions for activity, a classless society, spiritual and material culture will abundantly blossom, with the aid of, and on the basis of, which humankind can only fulfill its great sacrificial duty before nature. For us, for people living at the dawn of human prosperity, the struggle for this future will remain the only real form of service to the highest aims of the thinking spirit. And to the struggle undertaken today, to the activity nowadays which fulfills our hypothesis, nothing is added to and nothing is removed from it. Adding only the proud, and having for now a purely aesthetic character, consciousness that the activity of humankind is made spiritual not only by the pathos of final human goals, but the fact that it has, as well as these, also a universal and historical meaning, and materializes immortal goals determined by the entire system of universal interaction. And in the light of this hypothesis set forth in a completely new way, the genial words of Dialectics of Nature sound with even greater prophetic strength. Quote, "But here, either we must have recourse to a creator, or we are forced to the conclusion that the incandescent raw material for the solar systems of our universe was produced in a natural way by transformations of motion which are, by nature, inherent in moving matter, and the conditions for which, therefore, must also be reproduced by matter, even if only after millions and millions of years and more or less by chance, but with the necessity that is also inherent in chance." That's Ingalls from 1974. I guess must be Dialectics of Nature. "And with the aid of our hypothesis, we acquire a new basis for the certainty that, quote, matter remains eternally the same in all its transformations, that none of its attributes can ever be lost, and therefore also that with the same iron necessity that it will exterminate its highest creation, the thinking mind, it must somewhere else and at another time again reproduce it or produce it." End quote. Again, Ingalls. "And therefore, we can add that the thinking spirit is not a barren flower that blossoms for a short moment only to fade again, almost immediately, but is just as much a condition for the existence of matter as it is a necessary.
Hello? My internet is connected. I'll finish that. Restarting. "And therefore we can add that the thinking spirit is not a barren flower that blossoms for a short moment only to fade again almost immediately, but is just as much a condition for the existence of matter as it is a necessary consequence of it. That is, an intrinsically posited, infinite, and universal condition of the objective reality of universal matter, the actual attribute of matter as an infinite substance of the universe."
Huh? What? You
I
disconnected
disconnected,
for a
yeah.
while.
Or did we still get the
Yeah,
recording though?
yeah.
Oh.
I just reread the
Nice.
last sentence.
Yeah, it's awesome.
So anyways, thoughts. My personal
Very-
thoughts is I prefer it to no spirituality, but it is not the spirituality which I would like aspire to. It's pretty. I mean, it's not nihilistic, but it's pretty
No.
close, in my opinion. Because I mean, at least for like Hegel and even mystics, all these things, like there's something higher to it other than like the perpetuation of life, just for the sake of life, the perpetuation of existence just for the sake of existence. at least with Hegel, it's the perpetuation of anything for the sake of freedom, whatever that may be. For other mystics, the perpetuation of the soul, or rather liberation of the soul, whatever, for the sake of some kind of freedom, as well as, also the full blossomings of whatever the spiritual realms are. So, I think his spiritual aspirations are very tame, but nonetheless they are indeed spiritual aspirations. So, I like that.
So,
Are we materialists now?
Nah.
No.
no.
No. I was just joking.
Like the whole thing about matter being primary, for example. I think that once you get to being able to edit your own genetic code, matter just goes out the window. Or, you can be a dirty transhumanist, in which case matter also goes out the window, and it's not primary anymore. It exists, ordered by the mind, upon the principles of the mind and whatnot. And then there's, if you believe in magic, well, then matter is ordered by other principles of higher realms of consciousness, which correspond to the mind.
Oh, yeah.
Not only that, I think physics, for example, has gone in a far more pessimistic and mood than just like, oh well, everything will just cool off. It's not the theory of the big chill isn't just that, oh well, there's everything's gonna stop moving and there's gonna become some matter around. They're far more pessimistic than that. They're like, oh yeah, everything's gonna be still, and then everything's gonna be swallowed by these ever increasingly large black holes, and then black holes will swallow black holes, and then they'll just be nothing but black holes for somewhere upwards of a couple 100 trillion years, plus some brown dwarfs, give or take. And in the meantime, those will evaporate, and they evaporate into pure radiation, which is nothing but fluctuations of the vacuum of space. And those two themselves dissipate and slowly become less and less vibrational, and eventually virtually flatline, and you will just have empty space, whatever space is. And indeed, we have no clue as to how in the world the generation of matter really occurs. There are theories, for example, that we have production going on all the time. There's ideas of quantum foam. That the vacuum is, for example, the concept of 0-point energy is based on a real effect of that. Somehow the emptiness of space has energy, therefore it must have some kind of material effects going on, virtual particles and all these whatnot things. And so the idea that creation and destruction is going on all the time is not crazy anymore. There's some empirical evidence for it, whatever that ultimately means. But we haven't seen any generation of any grand scale material anything. We haven't seen clouds of matter start to coalesce or whatnot. All we really see are just anything that's already been determined in the form of stars and galactic light and whatnot. Hegel's a bit more positive about that. I think there's reason to be. There is really no reason to think that the hypothesis of the heat death of the universe is actually even logically coherent. Mainly because we do see this constant production and destruction of material in the universe on the quantum scale, as well as we still see young galaxies. We see old galaxies, young galaxies everywhere. So new galaxies are being born as we speak, everywhere. And so how in the world this happens, we have no fucking clue. We have no fucking clue how stars really are made. The whole accretion model, we don't really see that happening. Stars tend to be born on these strange filaments in nebulas, so it's kind of like a cosmic thunderbolt of sorts, according to some people. So we don't really understand what the whole system of nature actually even is. So the judgments that he's making, he admits they're purely speculative, and I'm pretty sure he was quite open to the fact that we would find out more, and it's like the whole idea changes. So I don't know. I don't think the ultimate spiritual aim really is to sacrifice ourselves for the restarting of the universe in another Big Bang. Doesn't seem like it's going to be necessary. Doesn't seem like it was necessary in our own past. I think if we survive, our spiritual goals will simply be to just basically be ancient aliens for some other people.
About what you said?
What we read.
Oh, yeah, I agree with you. That, interesting, better than most, not good enough. But still cool. I like this. Like, there are some things I definitely agree with, like the form of the perpetuation of life in that sense, sure. I mean, it had to happen that way for aliens to exist, for example. But, yeah, life as life, as for life's sake, not for me. There has to be some sort of teleological expectation or something to satisfy me. But this guy, I mean, okay. Mook made a stupid ass video, obviously. I watched it, unfortunately. Someone, talked about state socialism and, being a Leninist conception that deviates from Marx. Marx just wanted to get rid of the state and have no classes or whatever, which is, technically true, I guess. But
this
I tried to
explain.
explain.
Is this the same Mook who read the critique of the Gotha program?
Wait,
It's the
what?
same Mook. Well, this is a guy on his video saying
Okay,
that.
because
It's not
if
Mook
Mook
saying.
is saying that, it's like the one thing he's read, and I don't know what the hell he's talking about.
No. And then this guy replied, I mean, I wrote some stuff about freely entered social classes, and then I quoted Winfield on classes, the injustice of a classless society. And the guy just responded K, and then some other guy replied the thing I sent about triangles are able to have 4 sides and angles.
Oh, so this guy literally doesn't even know math, basically.
No.
Okay.
Well, no, he's saying that that's just as nonsensical as triangles having 4 sides and angles.
Yeah, well,
I'm pretty sure that's what he's
I'm
saying.
pretty sure he just doesn't get it. But anyways, we're getting away from Ilyenkov. Unless we have other comments, judgments, what have you.
What? You're recording still?
Well, yeah.
Why?
So did you hear me say, okay, everybody, goodbye? No.
No. But you disconnected.
All right, everybody, you heard it here. Hope you enjoyed the recording. Goodbye.
Goodbye.